Ya, nanti kalau ini layarnya udah udah sesuaikan, nanti dibuka aja ruangannya, terus setel musik-musik yang kayak kemarin sambil nunggu narasumber, nggak apa-apa. Oke. Nanti saya harus men-setting co-host dan yang lain-lain di Zoom tadi kan? Iya. Atau mereka otomatis sudah masuk ya? Mas Garpinnya aja. Nanti kalau udah di-effect kan udah dimulai webinarnya pada masuk. Minimal Mas Garpin di-assign sebagai host atau co-host. Untuk co-host aja jangan co-host. Oh iya, co-host. Karena Mbak Gita harus memilih live. Nanti susah ininya ngaturnya. Oke. Itu Rahel nanti yang masuk. Rahel? Mas Garpinnya aja. Nanti kalau udah di-webinarnya minimal Mas Garpin di-assign sebagai host atau co-host. Co-host aja jangan co-host. Karena Mbak Gita harus memilih live. Nanti susah ininya ngaturnya. Itu Rahel nanti yang masuk.
Hari ini adalah lembaran baru bagiku. Ku di sini karena kau yang memilihku. Ku ragu akan cintamu. Hari ini adalah lembaran baru bagiku. Ku di sini karena kau yang memilihku. Ku ragu akan cintamu. Hari ini adalah lembaran.
Through the door, through the door, through where no one's been before. But it feels like home. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say I've lost my mind. I don't care, so cold. I know what's really. We can live in a running place. I hope. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say I've lost my mind. I don't care, so cold. What's really? We can live in a running place. I hope. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say I've lost my mind. I don't care, so cold. What's really? We can live in a running place. I hope. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say I've lost my mind.
Hello. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Bapak Ibu. so, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm very happy to meet you today on our second day of e-conference of CAPIN, Consortium Psikologi Ilmiah Nusantara. Well, it's the first experience for me to moderate a seminar in English. So I'm a little bit nervous, but well, uh, it's a pleasure to me. And it's a pleasure to me too to meet you, all of you, the attendees, and of course, Dr. Mary Brehany. Hello, Dr. Mary. I think it's afternoon right now in New Zealand, right? so,
That's right. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in New Zealand.
okay, so good afternoon, Dr. Mary Brehany. It's 9 a.m. morning in Indonesia right now. Okay, so according to our agenda, today Dr. Mary Brehany with Professor Christine Stevens will present their results about different experiences of anxiety among older adults in Aotearoa or New Zealand during COVID-19 lockdown. Well, the topic is very interesting, and I'm very eager to learn more. But well, I got an information from the committee that Professor Christine Stevens cannot join us today. But well, she already recorded a video, so we still can watch the video. And after we watch the video, we will move to the question and answer session with Dr. Mary Brehany. Am I right, Doctor?
Yes, that's right. Unfortunately, Chris sends her apologies. She was unable to come and present in person today.
Mhm.
But if we just run through the presentation that she's provided, and then I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mary. So, uh, ladies and gentlemen, so when you watch the video and you have questions in the question and answer session, you may ask it to Dr. Mary Brehany and she will be very happy to answer it. So before we start the video, I want to read some the CP of our speakers today. So I will start from Professor Kristen Stevens. So Professor Kristen Stevens is a professor from School of Psychology of Massey University. She got her PhD in psychology from Massey University, and she is specialized in health psychology, community psychology, research methods, and her research focus is aging and well-being and community health. And our second speaker for today, Dr. Mary Brehany, is an associate professor from School of Health Sciences from Massey University. She is specialized in health inequalities, economic inequalities, and gerontology. Well, I think that's the short profile of our speakers. I cannot read it all because it's very long. Both of them have very lot publications, both research journal, research article, book chapters, and books. So I just can read it shortly. Okay, so Ibu Dia Lestari has been standby to play the video, the presentation from Professor Stevens. Okay, are you ready, Bu Dia? So
Yeah,
we
I'm
can,
ready. So
so we
shall we
can,
start now?
yeah, we can
Yeah.
start it now. So
Okay.
silakan Ibu Dia. Okay, seems there is a problem. There is trouble.
Many commentators this year have warned of the dangers of these results of a qualitative study of older people's
sorry, because I unmute maybe, so
Okay.
because I mute maybe, so I will start the video again so you guys can hear it, the video, right?
Okay.
Is it right?
Thank you, Bu.
Yeah.
Kia ora koutou, warm greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you, and particular thanks to Ms. Dia Listari for inviting us here to share our work with your meeting. This is the results of a qualitative study of older people's experiences of the COVID-19 lockdown this year. My co-author, Dr. Mary Brini, and I are members of the Health and Ageing Research Team at Massey University in Aotearoa. Our research with older people is being funded by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in New Zealand, as you can see on this first slide. So in the COVID-19 epidemic, many countries have recommended or required older people to remain more strictly isolated than others. And this is because of the additional risks to their health. But these rules about isolation effectively mean that people can be very cut off, especially if they live alone. And many commentators this year have warned of the dangers of these restrictions for the health of older people. In particular, there has been widespread concern about the effects of social isolation on older people's mental health. And some early evidence has supported these fears of increased mental health issues among older people, showing that mental distress, such as anxiety, was high during the early stages of the pandemic. However, there are also equivocal findings in the literature so far, and some show that older people are no more distressed than younger people, or that older people were less anxious about their risks. So these differences highlight the importance of recognising the heterogeneity of older people, that there's a wide diversity among older people. They're not just all the same because they've got old. There are differences in social class and their education, gender, of course, wealth, ethnicity, personality, and sexuality, just like for everybody else. But means that these differences mean that age in years is not a good indicator of health. In recognition of the diversity of older people's social situations and their individual resilience differences means that while we recognise vulnerability because of ageing, interventions to support older people in pandemic or disaster situations must take these differences into account. So in this study, we explored the perspectives of older people themselves. We wanted to ask about the provisions that support older people during a COVID-19 pandemic and during the social distancing regulations that were in force. What did people think about it? The study took place in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in which such regulations and provisions took a particular form. And New Zealand is a small island nation of around 5 million people in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. The first case of COVID-19 was reported in February 2020 in a New Zealand resident returning from Iran. The New Zealand government had already closed the border to non-nationals. As the virus spread through the community, a national state of emergency was declared in March, followed by a lockdown 2 days later. The entire population was to remain in their homes and associate only with their immediate household members. So there were to be no public gatherings. Accordingly, any travel beyond the home except for exercise in the immediate vicinity or trips to grocery shops or healthcare facilities, was banned. All non-essential businesses, schools, bars, restaurants and food takeaways, liquor stores, gyms, swimming pools and services like hairdressers were closed, and only designated essential workers were permitted to work under strict protocols. The public health system promoted clear public messages about these regulations and health-related behaviours, like washing hands and keeping distance. And government financial assistance was available for employers, for businesses and for individuals. The Prime Minister and her ministers and officials communicated daily with the public about these measures, and they provided updates on the cases and deaths every day. And they used this opportunity to promote a sense of common national purpose, and the purpose was to eliminate the virus from New Zealand. This lockdown was eased progressively through April and May, and restrictions were lifted in June when it became apparent that the virus had been eliminated. Well, that was for the time being. So to answer the question about older people's perspectives on support during the COVID-19 pandemic, we used a qualitative analysis of written comments on a national survey. The participants were among respondents to the 2020 wave of the Health, Work and Retirement longitudinal study of older community dwelling adults. In 2020, the wave of this study has a cohort of around 4,000 participants, and they're aged from 55 to 85 years. We also oversampled for people of Māori descent, and that's to ensure that we have adequate representation of Indigenous New Zealanders. The survey was conducted around 3 weeks after the lockdown was eased in early June. And on the survey, which was fairly lengthy, participants were also invited to write any comments about their lockdown experiences in a blank space just on the back of the survey questionnaire. So the participants in this study were 730 survey respondents who did write comments about their COVID-19 experiences. And you can see the age groups on the slide. There were 236 men and 475 women, and 172 were in full-time employment, 162 in part-time employment, 13 were unemployed and seeking work, 23 unable to work, and the majority of 304 were retired, and there were 55 others who were missing out these details. 159 people of these were living alone. Some respondents in this part of the study wrote 1 or 2 sentences, and others wrote quite lengthy commentaries. And all these written responses were coded and then analysed to identify the main themes across the comments. We were interested in people's accounts of their anxiety and any factors that might have helped. So that was the focus of our initial findings. So first of all, we considered how people talked about anxiety. Many participants reported experiencing some form of anxiety. They described the word anxiety. They also used words like nervousness, anger, sadness, terror, stress, and fear. And their anxiety was caused by their personal vulnerability to the COVID illness, worry about themselves, but worry about their children and worry about everybody. Worry about losing their job and about unknown futures for themselves, for their family and for the world. Some described not even going out for essential services, like to do the shopping, because of their anxiety. And others described becoming anxious as they stayed inside. And so, for example, someone said, I had lots of things to do during the lockdown, but after a day or two, I became restless, lethargic, and quite anxious. I felt lonely and started to miss physical touch at times, like a skin hunger. I had weird dreams as well. Oh, sorry, went too far. What's happened there? Have to watch that. I found the pandemic very scary, being a person of 78 years. I lost all my love of anything important to me. Missing all my family shows how important many things really are. A few participants also reported experiencing serious mental health issues, which included anxiety disorders needing treatment or previous depression getting worse, and it did include a suicide attempt. But these were cases that warranted dedicated mental health support, and they were relatively rare. Most reports of anxiety were leavened by expressions of enjoyment and feelings of being supported. So you've already had a little pre-taste of the enjoyment and support slide, so now I'm going to go on to those ones. So there were a lot of expressions of enjoyment. In fact, most of the stories, or it felt like to us reading them, that they were about having a good time during lockdown and enjoying the lockdown time. So many of those who did report anxiety also described the aspects that they enjoyed, or they described a shift from worry to enjoyment, as in this first brief example. I was anxious initially, but after all, it was so relaxing to have the 7 weeks at home and smell the roses. And this quote's a good example because that smelling the roses and all those cliches come up quite a bit. Having the time to slow down and relax was one of the many aspects that people enjoyed. And in general, respondents described their delight in a time for personal reflection, catching up on garden and home chores and hobbies, and quality time with family members. And people also talked a lot about enjoying the lack of noise, the quiet roads for walks and bicycle rides, and a time of calm and peace, or a time of contentment. And many hoped that they would remember the lessons of this time. They wanted to talk about how they learnt to enjoy life and appreciate their family, and they hoped that they would carry on doing that. Now, older people who lived alone generally said that they did not change their daily lives. Some, and so here's an example on this same slide, found additional benefits from lockdown because they got more attention from their family and support from community organisations and support from the whole country. So this person provides a good example of that. She's 83, surprised at how well she coped. Her 2 children contacted him more than usual. She worked out how to have her groceries delivered, and she's enjoyed the time, and also she enjoyed the 3 separate organisations that phoned to check if she was all right. And more friends and family phoned a lot to see if I needed anything. She wasn't too worried about the virus, and she had a warm and proud feeling about how the fellow countrymen were behaving and coping with the difficulties of lockdown. And several other people also reported getting on better with their neighbours, although at a distance, and a general feeling of warm conviviality. And these included stories of people waving and greeting from a distance every day, and sharing regular evening drinks with neighbours where they sat outside their houses, and they had not done that before at all. And in general, these respondents enjoyed the time and space for physical activity, for maintaining their social connections locally or virtually by Zoom or other electronic means, and a sense of shared purpose. So that's the enjoyment part of things. Now, people who told these enjoyment stories mentioned the importance of support from the government and associated agencies. Although there was some criticism of government actions, a great majority of the people who wrote praised the government decisions. And one form of government support was clear daily communications, which were much appreciated. So that's why the first quote here exemplifies that. The updates at 1 p.m. each day were excellent, felt connected with the whole of New Zealand, and information was given calmly and informatively. Definitely helped with living alone, although I had good contact with family. Updates made me feel part of 5 million whānau. So whānau is the Māori word for family, and the 5 million team, or the 5 million whānau, was an expression that was often used by the Prime Minister. The team of 5 million were working together. So that got reproduced in these quotes as well. People enjoyed the leadership style and the additional economic support that was targeted to those on the New Zealand pension or other welfare benefits that they received. So here's another quote that encapsulates those sort of expressions. My husband and I were very grateful to the government for the extra winter energy payment we received during the pandemic. It meant we used clothes dryer and heater more during the lockdown, which was winter. We looked forward to the daily news updates on the pandemic and thought Jacinda Ardern and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield were calm and reassuring. Dr. Ashley, I can tell you, is the director of the public health, or the health ministry, the director of the Ministry of Health, better get him right. And he became very famous. In fact, I have a bag in my room, which I can show you, that somebody gave me at some point, with Dr. Ashley Bloomfield printed on the cover. And this became quite a famous meme, and my husband's been given a T-shirt with Dr. Ashley Bloomfield on the cover as well. So she says, it wasn't a hardship for us. We felt very well cared for. Our grandson also received the wage subsidy, which he was very grateful for. So people also described their own personal resilience. Some remembered the polio epidemic in New Zealand when they had to be homeschooled because all the schools and everything were closed down. And that was quite a long time ago now, in the late 1940s in New Zealand, or more recent earthquake or other disasters that they've survived. So there are also stories of, well, old age means that we've experienced all this before and we know how to do it. And others wrote about the support that they received from their religious faith. There was a great deal of pride expressed in the efforts of New Zealanders together in this most recent disaster. So in general, people who wrote about enjoying lockdown also expressed anxiety. And their fears were largely alleviated by a sense of personal resilience and support from family and friends, and support from all New Zealanders. And this included a strong sense of being cared for by the government and non-governmental organisations. And this quote that I put up here exemplifies this mix of feelings. Overall, I quite enjoyed the restrictions of lockdown and had marvellous support from family and loads of contact with friends. I missed cuddles and sleepovers with my grandkids though, although they kept in touch well and would come round and blow kisses through the window. Although it may sound contradictory to my first comment, I've been continuing to be hugely concerned about the pandemic and how the world has handled it, and have experienced anxiety for the first time. The world's future is uncertain, and these pandemics and extremes will continue to affect us all, I believe. Thank goodness for good leadership on the whole in New Zealand and decisive actions. So it's quite a good summarising quote, really, because she covers a lot of the themes that other people brought up. So many of the people writing were aware of that enjoying lockdown was a privilege. So they often commented on that too. They often experienced their awareness of and concern that for those who were in more difficult situations. Lockdown was enjoyable for older people who were retired, for those who were able to work from home, or those who were supported by government wage subsidies. However, many older people are in paid work, and for those in our sample who were deemed essential workers or threatened with job loss, the time was often very difficult. Most of those who became anxious were not confined to the house, but they were essential workers. So I'm saying, you know, they weren't confined to the house because in the initial concerns about older people becoming anxious and suffering mental health issues, the general idea was that it would be because they were confined to their houses and isolated. But the people who had the most difficulties were people who had to go out. And so that's the reason for this quote. Because I'm an essential worker, the COVID-19 period was an intensely busy time and extremely hectic. Since the return to work, I've struggled to keep up with the workload, and the staffing's been reduced and no replacement has been employed. So this worker is not experiencing a good time at all. Nothing to do with being isolated. And then as a frontline worker, that's a nurse at a GP practice, I've worked all the way through. And this is a common story of people who were essential workers. My colleagues and I are exhausted, we need a break. And now we find ourselves busier than ever. It's hard to see people moving about as normal. And now more respiratory illnesses are starting to surface. So we're swabbing more patients than ever we did in lockdown. Very stressful. So somebody else also mentioned that although she was working, she felt very anxious about losing her job and had no real connections to people or purpose for being alive, and became sick and depressed. And this is someone who was going out and working. The other source of anxiety was about losing jobs. So COVID-19 related job loss often meant sudden retirement for these older people because of the difficulties of regaining employment or retraining in older age. So here are some brief quotes from people in that sort of situation. A person working at the border and suddenly having to take early retirement simply because of the lack of passengers now coming into New Zealand. Much reduced, of course. Our borders have been closed for almost a year now. And there is some chance that this person says that in the next 2 to 3 months, the organisation I work for may have to restructure. And this is because of COVID-19. And if I lose my job because of this, it would have very negative consequences. My job is important to me. So this is a person facing a possible loss of his job. And of course, that was a very real fear because a lot of people have continued to lose their jobs. Another person who has a realistic concern because as the airports were shut down, and clearly that was where this person worked, then they are unlikely to have further employment. And certainly the airlines have continued to cut staff. So all the participants understood about the workers' problems, and there was a lot of sympathy expressed for them. But there was less awareness of the situations of the many older people who are caring for others, like children, grandchildren, or their spouses. And the difficulties for these people included the loss of their social network support and being left alone to care for the person that they had responsibility for, as in this brief account. This person says, being a social butterfly, I found the lockdown stages at level 3 and 4 quite hard to accept. Note well, he says, this is tied in with the fact that currently my wife and I are starting to go through the early stages of an assessment to see if she is starting to suffer from dementia. With just the two of us in lockdown, this added to the problems of how I felt. But the most poignant stories were of difficulties experienced since nursing homes enforced more stringent distancing requirements. And these stories came from men and women who were separated from their spouses. In this second example on this slide, the respondent describes this sort of separation. I live alone in my own home and I feed my wife a midday meal every day in the rest home where she has lived for 9 years with advanced dementia. During the COVID-19 lockdown, I was not allowed to visit her for about 2 months. I talked to her several times each week. Well, when the rest home staff facilitated a video link. So there was support, but as you'll see in the next story, that wasn't necessarily sufficient to continue these important connections. So this woman describes in some detail the mental and physical health effects of the separation on her husband and her own distress. At my stage of life, the COVID-19 lockdown was most disturbing in the enforced separation from my husband of 55 years. He displayed his own mental distress by taking down from the walls of his room many photos and much-loved pictures, which he had been enjoying. The arranged Skype calls were mostly very successful, but at other times very noisy and invasive. Fortunately, I live with our daughter and she was able to help me with this new technology. Rest home staff were very loving and supportive of us both. I cannot find any fault with the way they set up processes to keep us safe. But on return to the normal visiting arrangements, I was quite shocked to observe the setback in his mobility and stability on his feet, and his very reduced freedom in his walking. I believe that my regular visits before lockdown were instrumental in keeping up his walking and his ability to speak clearly. Sad, as that has demonstrated the value of regular family visits to their loved ones in rest homes and hospitals. And the reward of family unity at this time of life is absolutely vital and satisfying. It should be seen as affirming the wholeness of family life. So these stories of difficulties and separation provide very strong contrast to the many accounts of relaxing and invigorating walking and bicycling and family Zoom sessions that were enjoyed by those others who were more physically and financially well off. So in conclusion, for the majority of people who were retired, able to work at home, or eligible for wage subsidies, the experience was largely very enjoyable and anxieties were ameliorated by a sense of being supported. Our findings on this study highlight the importance of strong government guidance and support. First, many older people appreciated the material support shown by wage and heating subsidies that were swiftly provided for them and for their wider families, and the support for a range of home contact and support services provided by local authorities and NGOs. These public health services included dedicated mental and mental health telephone helplines whose contact numbers were included in all public health messages. And second, the cohesive leadership provided by the government, which included daily information updates and clear, consistent messages from the Prime Minister, led to a sense of security and social cohesion. And this was reflected in the talk reproduced in our participants' accounts, which consistently repeated the catchphrases of those messages, such as Team of 5 million or Be Kind. And this leadership was supported by Māori and Pacific Island leaders and politicians of all political persuasions. So for a time, the country did express a strong sense of unity which in turn supported those who may have felt more helpless or alone. But those people who did not feel sufficient support to alleviate their anxiety were essential workers, and those who lost their employment, and those who were caring for dependent others. By drawing on a broad community dwelling sample of older people, our analysis has shown that focusing our concerns on the loneliness or anxiety of isolated older people in lockdown at home ignores this diversity of older people's circumstances. Relying on stereotypes of all older people as retired and physically or mentally vulnerable, we neglect to understand other kinds of stressful situations, such as those experienced by older people in difficult work situations or who become suddenly unemployed. Older people who are currently employed, and that's around 25% of all employed people in New Zealand, and around 50% in our whole cohort of our survey. So these people who are working still require some focused concern. And the plight of workers also includes those unpaid older workers who care for others. We see them as workers as well, these caregivers. The proportion of caregivers in older age groups has increased at a faster rate than in the general population. And this study highlighted the distress of caregivers, especially those who were separated from the people they care for by the lockdown, and the negative consequences for those who are needing family care. So discussions of older people as one group who may be segregated from society and potential care ignores the anxiety created for the growing number of older people who are actively engaged in providing caring and in paid work. Many participants in our study do both. So Aotearoa, New Zealand continues to develop its COVID-19 response as a nation. As all countries refine their epidemiological and medical responses, the response to the needs of older citizens should be broadened to include the diversity of older adult situations and experiences, rather than assuming that everybody over a certain age is in the same situation and has similar needs. So thank you. That's the end of this talk. The Health and Ageing Research team are now analysing more quantitative and qualitative data from our participants about their COVID-19 experiences in particular. We now have qualitative data from over 800 participants, and this is a rich source of information alone, but we also have the survey responses from over 4,000 participants in our health, work and retirement study. And we'll soon be in a position to contribute important information about the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown on older New Zealanders in other ways. Thank you for inviting us to contribute to this meeting. I am very sorry, many apologies that I could not be with you today, but Associate Professor Mary Brenny, who is the other author of this study, is here to answer your questions. And I do hope the rest of the meeting is going really well. Kia ora.
Okay, so that is it, the presentation from Professor Stevens. Now we shall move to the question and answer session, but what I've learned from the presentation is for some older adults in New Zealand, some of them experience alleviated fears, some of them experience support from others, some of them experience job unemployment, and well, I'm glad to know that some of them get the anxiety reduced by strong government support, by material support, cohesive leadership and information, and sense of unity. But it's unfortunately that some of them, especially like essentials workers, lost employments and caregivers are not support to relieve anxiety. That's what I learned from the presentation. So now we are on question and answer session. To all of the attendees who want to ask questions to Dr. Mary Brehani, you may write down the question in the chat box and I will gladly ask it to Dr. Mary Brehani. So please, Bapak Ibu.
And while we're waiting for the questions to come through, I think it's thank you for that summary of what we found in our research. And it's important to remember that the age range of the people who are in the survey, so they were from 55 to about 84 years. So of course, when we've got people across essentially 30 years of life, there will be differences by age as well. The other thing, I guess, to note, which will be really interesting to hear people's comments on in your different countries, is that we have quite a high rate of paid employment among older people in New Zealand. So as Professor Christine said there, about 50% of our survey participants are in some form of paid work. And so that might be different in different countries. There might be different rates of paid work. The other thing to note that we have in New Zealand, which might also be a point of interest for your participants, is that we have a universal pension for older people that is paid by the government. So all citizens over the age of 65 years receive a government pension, and they can continue to work and to receive this as well. So that's a little bit different perhaps from some of the other countries that your participants come from.
Yeah, so different countries may experience different kind of anxieties too, right, Dr. Mary?
Yeah, and I think that would be something that I'd be very interested to hear from your participants as well, because what we talked about a lot for the analysis was around the government support and a sense of support and the way that alleviates the anxiety. Some of that was material support, some of that was around pensions, but some of it was around trust in the government as well. And I guess around the world at the moment, we have differences around the level of trust in the government. And I see that there is a question that's come up. Do you want to read out the questions, or how would you like to manage this?
Okay, so there's the first question. Okay, may I read it? Do you think the cultural background, aside from its economical advantage of New Zealand, greatly influenced this study? Would this be applicable to other countries with similar culture? Well,
yeah, I guess we've started to talk about that already, hadn't we? It's a really good question. That I guess the first thing is around what we understand by a cultural background. So in New Zealand, we have quite a multicultural country. The majority culture is we would call Pākehā, which is New Zealanders of European descent. We have a large minority of Indigenous people who are New Zealand Māori, and then we have smaller numbers of many other cultures. So there isn't a singular cultural background for New Zealand. It's quite a multicultural country. So even though we talked about in the findings that only about, I think, 170 people in New Zealand lived alone, that a majority of those people would live with a spouse or partner, and there'd be smaller numbers who live in intergenerational family situations. And the number of people, so in intergenerational family living arrangements, say, as you might have noted from one of the quotes, they talked about living with children and grandchildren. And so that sort of a context too will shape whether or not people feel worried or anxious, whether they feel that they have enough support. So all of those things, I think, would shape how people respond. From our findings, though, I think one of the biggest parts was a sense of trust in the government, that there was very strong public health messaging in New Zealand, that because of our geographical isolation, that it was feasible to shut the borders, that it would be feasible to eliminate the virus. There was really powerful messaging around that. And I think from the quotes you can see that people took up that challenge quite strongly and trusted that the government was making the correct decisions for us. I guess if you think of that as part of the cultural background, as part of the social context of New Zealand, then I think it really did shape the findings of this study.
Okay, so what I note from the answer is majority of the elders are live with their spouse, with their grandchildren, with their children also. So it may affect the anxiety, yeah, for them during the lockdown. Well, I think in Indonesia too, most of the older adults live with their children and their grandchildren too. So for some extent, it may be applicable to Indonesia, but for some extent, like, well, Indonesia also gets some support from the government. Like we have bantuan sosial or social help. So the government gives some what kind of canned sardines, rice, instant noodles, yeah, kind of that to help the people affected by COVID-19. Well, but yeah, because Indonesia is very huge, mostly islands. Yeah, maybe some difference with New Zealand, especially about the unity.
Okay, and I think that's a really important point. So New Zealand is a comparatively underpopulated island. So we have 5 million people only in the whole country. And so I guess some of that messaging around uniting together and working together, perhaps that works better in a smaller country, which has a more sort of cohesive team feel, I guess. And it would be interesting to note whether or not that would work in a larger and more diverse country.
Okay. So, Dr. Mary, I found another questions from the chat box. Okay, so may I read it? So, hello, my name is Stephanie Raihana. Her name is Stephanie Raihana Hamdan from Department Psychology of Universitas Islam Bandung. We know COVID-19 affects to all nations, including Indonesia. As a multicultural and very diverse nation, Indonesia didn't apply lockdown. Didn't apply lockdown to face the COVID, and only apply restricted restrict some areas, some towns or cities to some activities. So her question is, how different culture, race, etc. in New Zealand society during the pandemic? Are diversity make a potential problem, or COVID-19 increase inclusive attitude among citizens? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's very, very interesting. I guess when we present the findings of the study in the way that we have today, there are always subtleties or differences that are expressed by some communities. So there were some small isolated communities who did feel very anxious that the lockdowns would not be sufficient to protect their vulnerable community members. So when I talk about that, I mean, there were some isolated Māori communities in rural New Zealand who took it upon themselves to also have roadblocks to restrict movement into their community. They were worried that people might come from the larger cities, that the tourists who were already in New Zealand when the lockdown happened might continue their travels around New Zealand and might therefore bring the COVID-19 to these quite often poor rural communities that would have very limited health service. So even in a small country like New Zealand, with a well-developed health system, with strong economic support for older people, even in a country like that, which I guess from your perspective looks very homogenous and not especially diverse, there were small pockets of concern, particularly among Māori communities that have high rates of chronic health conditions. So they did take things into their own hands a little bit. They restricted movement into those communities. They set up community organised roadblocks, and with the support of the police, often restricted people coming from the larger cities into their areas. The reason they did that is that so New Zealand has a reasonably well developed health service, but we're underpopulated, which means that if you live in a rural area, you might live quite a long way from the nearest hospital. So if you are in a small deprived community, you might have to travel for many hours to get to a hospital. And those community members were worried that their vulnerable older people would become unwell. So I think it does depend a lot on the context. And that's why it's a really good question that's been asked there, because there were differences even in New Zealand. And I feel sure that with a more diverse country, such as Indonesia, you would get even greater differences.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mary. So move to the next question from Sinta Febrina. So the question is, essential workers, lost employment, and caregivers are those who weren't support to relieve anxiety. Which group who were most vulnerable to anxiety? And the second question is, what intervention that can be attempted and most effective intervention to resolve high level of anxiety?
I guess that the findings that we've shown is that rather than a single intervention that would work for everybody, is that when we look at older people and when we think about what older people need, that they're actually more diverse than people of other ages because they've had a lifetime of differences. So I guess one of the major findings that we have is that a lot of the concerns for older people and their anxiety were based on very stereotypical ideas around what older people are and what older people need. But when we looked at our results, the important thing is that there were good interventions put in place that worked. So as the participants showed with their quotes, there were interventions around phoning people to make sure they were okay. And one of the participants that Professor Christine read out was around somebody who'd been rung by 3 different organisations to make sure that they were okay. So those interventions were excellent and they worked. They were things around aged care groups, ringing people and making sure that they had access to support, to somebody to do their shopping and those kinds of things. So that's excellent. But what we found the gaps was around interventions for people who were in later life and older, but rather than being isolated in their homes, which is a stereotype around older people, that actually they were more worried about the fact that they still had to go out in the world, but had chronic health conditions as well. or that they still needed to provide care, some for people who were living with the person they were providing care for, and other people also needed to provide care for people who are living in different households. And those kinds of situations, there weren't enough interventions around that. So around what would you do if you were a caregiver for someone else who didn't live with you? So the lockdown was around keeping people in their own households and limiting the virus by limiting movement between households. And that made it very difficult if people were caring for somebody who wasn't in their house. So a disabled child, a disabled adult child, or an elderly parent or parent-in-law that was not in their household. So I guess for us, the interventions assumed that older people were the recipients of care, and that was fine. And for those older people, there was good support. There was much less for older people who might have been the givers of care. There was much less for older people who were still in employment but worried about their own health. So it's around those sorts of interventions and recognizing that older people come from a lot of different situations, and many of them are still caregivers and still in employment. So seeing those sorts of issues is important for older people as well.
Okay. So next question, Dr. Mary Brahani from, there's two questions. I will read one first, then after you answer it, I will read the another question. So the first question is, from those concluded, what is your, he means the researcher team, recommendation? What is your recommendation regarding the best intervention approach to relieve anxiety for essential workers, caregivers, or other those impacted negatively from these conditions? So about best intervention approach.
I think for many, the anxiety is around uncertainty. So I guess for it's a really difficult thing to know, because in a pandemic, the uncertainty is inherent, isn't it? We don't know how long it will last. We don't know what it is that will be required. But for many older people who were providing care, the uncertainty was around not knowing how long the lockdown would go on for and how long it would be before they could see their people in rest homes, or before they would be able to access the people who lived in other households. I think in hindsight, the benefit of hindsight is that we can see now that some of the loosening up of the lockdown rules possibly could have been incorporated into the lockdown earlier on. So after the virus had started to get under control, New Zealand started to loosen the rules and say that single person households could join together so that two people who lived alone could shop together or go out together, or essentially function as one household. And that happened at the end. But arguably, with the benefit of hindsight, that could have happened earlier, because that could provide support for people who need it around providing care for others or joining out smaller households together. It would still limit the spread of the virus, but would enable support for those people who are providing care and who might need the support of others to actually go to the supermarket or access essential services. So I think that the real benefit of doing this research is to say that we can see now, with the benefit of hindsight, that we could perhaps have had less stringent lockdown rules that enable better support for people who are continuing to provide care and continuing to work. So for some people who said that they were essential workers, they had to continue to go to their place of employment. But for them, for some households, they talked about how much easier it was that someone else in their household did the grocery shopping to allow them to focus on being a worker. And those sorts of arrangements we could perhaps have as an intervention earlier on.
Okay. So maybe we need to consider a lot of conditions regarding to the differences of the individuals, right, Dr. Mary? So the second question is there any spiritual approach they use to cope or that can impact their feeling according to your qualitative data?
Yes, as Professor Christine said in there, many of the people in our study who had a strong belief in God or a strong connection to a religious faith, they did talk about that. They talked about how that gave them comfort, how a sense that it was part of a broader plan that God had for them. That provided a lot of comfort for those people. And obviously that is just a personal difference that people have. There's a great deal of variability in New Zealand around whether or not people have attachment to a religious faith or attendance at religious organisations. Not only, though, I guess, is it about personal faith, but for those people who are involved in religious organisations, that was also another source of practical support, where people would ring those in their church, make sure that they were okay. So I guess religious faith is one part of it, but the practical support that comes with belonging to a religious organisation is also important.
Okay, so there's also some spiritual approach, especially support from the religious organization. So for some people in Indonesia, spiritual approach is very important too. For Indonesians, some of friends say that we still can find blessings in disguise. This COVID-19 maybe have a larger or bigger God's plan. That's the spiritual approach in Indonesia. Some of Indonesians do. There's another question from YouTube viewer, Dr. Mary. So we are multi-platform. Are older people get special treatment by government in New Zealand during COVID-19?
Yes, actually, so I talked before about how in New Zealand, all citizens and indeed permanent residents over the age of 65 do get a universal pension. The government also increased that during the COVID lockdown. They added an additional winter payment. So that was to cover, because the lockdown in New Zealand occurred in our winter, the winter payment was designed to cover the additional costs that people would have because they were staying home. So in recognition that more people were confined to their houses and would need to heat their own home, there was an extra payment that was made and extended for older people on the pension and also for people on other welfare benefits. There were additional wage subsidies that were provided for employers so that they could continue to pay wages for people even if they were unable to attend their work. So there were a number of mechanisms by which the government gave very practical financial support to both older people and people who were who had lost their employment either temporarily or permanently due to COVID.
Okay. Next, there is another question from Ibu Dia Lestari. So the question is, okay, she wrote that it is a very interesting research. I recognize that it is part of national survey. How did the team manage a large qualitative data set? It will be room for improvement for our research in Indonesia. Thank you. So, Dr. Mary, how did you and the team manage that large qualitative data?
Yes, so as I said there, it was part of a large longitudinal postal survey. So the data that we used for this analysis was handwritten on the back of the surveys that people posted back into us. When they arrived back to the research team, we had a research assistant type them up into a database, and then that was extracted with their other survey data. So the analysis that we've provided here is the first analysis that we've done, but we can link the survey answers to the longitudinal data that we have for those participants. So we actually extracted it into an Excel spreadsheet and we coded it using that. But if we wish to do more fine-grained analysis of the data by people's well-being scores or their employment status or their age, we would be able to do that because the comments on the back of the survey are actually linked to all of their other data.
Okay. So,
Thank you.
okay. Thank you, Dr. Mary Brahani, for the answer. Maybe Ibu Dia still have another question to ask. So, well, I also have the same question too with Ibu Dia, but Ibu Dia has asked it, yeah, how to manage that large qualitative data. To be honest, I'm very impressed too. Well, it's more than 700 participants, right? More than 700 participants in, wow. I'm very impressed,
Yeah.
Dr. Mary.
That is, I mean, I guess for qualitative work, it's a large number, but as we said in the presentation, and that Professor Christine, that some of the comments were very brief and then some were very long and extended. I mean, some of the ones that we included in the presentation, as you can see, provided quite a lot of detail. There were a lot of similarities in the replies, though, which we were really struck by. So we have now over 800 replies because they keep coming in. Even now, we have some more coming in towards the end of the year. But I guess there were really a lot of similarities in the stories that people told, which we found to be a really interesting finding, even in and of itself, that there were a lot of stories around how much people enjoyed the space to think differently, to be able to spend time with family, to enjoy that space that lockdown provided. And so when you're analysing such a large data set, it was quite striking to have such a lot of uniformity in the stories that people told. There were differences, but the overwhelming sort of similarity, I guess, aids in that analysis of such a large data set, where we can look at it and see that the enjoyment stories had a lot of similarities to them, and then to go out and to focus in on those other stories of concern or worry and think, given that these are quite different from all the others, what are the situational differences that produce those concerns? Why is it that these large group of people who are worried initially had their concerns so easily supported by government, by family, and by their situation? And why is it that there are these other groups of people whose worries persisted? And so that is the focus of our concern. But I guess when you're talking about such a large data set, it's important to remember that this is not interview data. So it's not really long transcripts of people's experiences. They are comparatively short and they are comparatively similar, which does aid in the analysis.
Okay. So that's how you manage that data. Thank you, Dr. Mary Brahani. That's a lot of insight for me, for for me personally, sometimes I am afraid to conduct qualitative research because I don't know how to manage so much data. Well, I think there's no another question.
May I ask
Ah,
a question again? Yeah.
yeah.
Is it a longitudinal study that you conduct with Prof. Christine, and maybe you can give us some brief explanation about how you maintain relationship between the researchers and also the participants, so we can we can learn about how to conduct a qualitative research for the longitudinal study.
That's a really interesting question, actually, because this is a longitudinal survey study. So the link that Professor Christine gave at the end, we really encourage you to go and look on the website there, because we've got a lot of information about the longitudinal study. The longitudinal study started in 2006. So some of the participants in our work have been involved for nearly 15 years. And that longitudinal study, though, is primarily a postal survey study. So it's primarily quantitative. And alongside that, we have done other qualitative projects. This project here is the first time that we have analysed the qualitative data from the survey responses in this particular way, because that was so striking. We realised that people were going to want to talk about their experiences of the COVID lockdown because of the timing of when the survey went out. And the timing was just coincidental. So we had the ethical approval to send out the survey already, and the survey was ready to go just prior to the lockdown. And of course, it had to be paused because there was no one to send it out. So what happened, I guess, in that is that, so we have a fairly standard survey that we send out every second year, that to the same participants, so it's longitudinal, the same people get the survey, and every second year we recruit more people aged 55 and 56. So that keeps the younger group going while the older people are aging through. So it's designed to be a representative survey of people aged over 55 in New Zealand, which means we have to keep recruiting people aged 55 as they age. So we were poised to go anyway. We had to pause it while we waited for the lockdown to lift. And in the meantime, we were able to go back to our ethics committee and request approval to add more questions. There were some quantitative questions on experiences of the lockdown, so they were added into the survey, and we requested approval to also add this general question at the back of the survey, which is what we've analysed. So because it was all ready to go, as soon as the lockdown lifted, we sent our standard survey out with these additional questions in it. And because of that, I guess, very fortuitous timing, was very lucky to have it ready to go anyway. The data that we have from these people is mostly from very close to the end of the lockdown. So most people would have received their surveys within a few weeks of the lockdown lifting. So these experiences were very present for them, very recent experiences for them. We then analysed the qualitative data at the end of that people had written on it first, because we are just now in the process of finalising the postal survey data for this year and linking that to participants' previous data. So because of that, I guess we have pre and post data. So we have data on the same participants for some of them, as I said, up to 15 years. And then we will have data after the lockdown. And we also have another wave planned for 2 years, which will enable us to see differences in well-being prior to the COVID lockdown, immediately after, and then 2 years after.
Yeah, very nice. Good luck.
That's right. Well, we're as Dia knows, I guess, that we always have far too much data. So we're always very, very keen to hear from people who are interested in our survey, who are interested in working with us to analyse these data. So if any of your participants are keen to get into contact with us about our study, we would be very happy to hear from people.
Maybe also potential PhD students from Indonesia, Mary.
Wah.
Absolutely. We are always happy to hear of people's ideas for how they might come and work with us on the data and make links around either working on projects related to Indonesia or coming to New Zealand. Although I guess coming to New Zealand might be a little problematic in the immediate future.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Mary, for the great explanation. You know, I'm very excited to listen. That's very, 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 very big what, research plan. I'm speechless. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mary. Seems that there is no question more to be asked. I guess it's the end of our session for this morning or for this afternoon. Okay. I, on behalf of the name of the committee and all of the attendees, offering my gratitude to you, Dr. Mary Brehani. I'm very grateful for this session, and please send my greetings to Professor Stevens. So, well,
Yes.
thank you, Dr. Mary.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting us to talk about our research. We've been very excited to share it with you this afternoon as it comes to the end of the working day here in New Zealand. Thank you so much. We've really enjoyed being involved with this.
Yeah, hope I can meet you on the next meeting or on the next event.
That's right, or even one day in person when the world opens back up. But wouldn't it be lovely?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so to all of the attendees, don't forget to fill the link that has been shared by Ibu Rahel Monica. The link is for the certificate. Please make sure the data that have been entered is already correct. Well, before we end this session, maybe Ibu Selviana, Ibu Karina, Ibu Rahel, and Ibu Ridhoi Purba can turn on the camera. We take some photo, virtual photo. We take a photo for the documentation. Okay, so I think 3 of us can take the photo. Ibu, Dr. Mary and Ibu Dia. So 1, 2, 3. Ibu Karina joined too. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, Ibu Ridhoi. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mary, Ibu Dia, Ibu Karina, Ibu Ridhoi, Ibu Selviana, and Ibu Monica. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving to the next session, to the parallel session. You can check your link on your email, because every participant has different rules. Thank you. See you, Dr. Mary. See you, Bapak, Ibu, and all of ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mas Garfield.
Sama-sama, Bu. Oh, Bu Dia, internetnya mantep nih, kenceng. Valid ya, Bu Ridhoi, Bu Karina.
Ya, bye, Mas.
Nah, dadah, thank you.
Yo. Hmm?